Welcome to another video on our show host series. I'm Christine, owner of Worthful Media. I want to talk today about the opportunities I'm seeing for people who have interest in hosting shows, podcasts, YouTube shows, or have already been hosting, and they're kind of done with not being paid. I've hinted at this in other videos in the series recently, but we're heading into 2024, and I think this is one of the biggest shifts I'm seeing in the creator economy, which, if you're familiar with that term, has been around for several years. It kind of references the economy that developed once the internet kind of became mainstream and people could make their own media and post it to the world, like on YouTube and social media and podcasting and blogging, and could get paid directly by clients, customers, sponsors without having to go through a big network or a studio or a publishing house. So the creator economy kind of refers to that whole world of being able to get paid directly for your work, that you kind of manage everything yourself. And you could say it's been around for over a decade online, but a lot has kind of come to a head, I would say, in the last 1 or 2 years, where the people who started doing this 10, 12, 15 years ago and just put in unbelievable amounts of time and unpaid labor in their basements, in their garages for years, just making amazing content for YouTube and social media, artists, videographers, sound engineers, musicians, graphic designers, fashionistas, stylists, all these amazing creatives that we loved watching. Think about the cool people on Instagram, 10 years ago that you loved following, who just made really cool content. Those people who are kind of what we now look to as oh man, we all want to be like them. If you want to be a creator and you want to get paid for your work and be online as your main place people find you, there has been a tone change, and not for good or bad reason, but because all things have to evolve, and podcasting falls in that same world. The early podcasters who were literally doing it for the love of the craft and loved the creativity of it and loved the conversation and the art of learning how to edit audio and publish and troubleshoot and do all the technical stuff and figure out their gear and set up their own studios in their houses, they have kind of come to a point where they're we're not interested in doing free work anymore for the internet. And what they mean is, and you may resonate with this if you've been thinking about this yourself for a while, there was a culture early on in the creator economy where the opportunity to connect directly with fans, customers, and sponsors was exciting and interesting enough that people were willing to do tons of unpaid labor just for the chance to build an audience that was big enough to attract, paid opportunities. And if you had a blog back in the day and you just tirelessly wrote those long blog posts, every week for years to build that audience, how much work it was. And it was exciting at the time because it was a new frontier. But what has changed, and what I see definitely changing even more going into 2024, is that people have wised up and the advertising and sponsorship industry has matured to where it no longer makes sense for most people, and you might be an exception, for most people who are looking to put quality time and effort into making a podcast or a YouTube show or another media project that lives online. It really doesn't make sense anymore to do it for free and to foot the bill and to just make it, because enough people have gotten into it. There's been enough saturation. Sponsors have figured out their profit margins and what works and what doesn't. And so there is a culture shift where creators, especially seasoned ones who have gotten paid often by sponsors, have really sort of just drawn a line and been I'm no longer doing things that I don't get paid for. I'm getting paid upfront, or I'm not doing it at all. Whether that's a sponsorship deal, a network deal, that can translate into TV, film, but also podcasting, YouTube. And I've had these conversations literally in the last few months with some, you call them OG creators, who've been around for a long time. They understand the value of the attention they command, meaning they've built a large loyal audience and they know how valuable that is to sponsors and advertisers and networks. And so when we talk about their interest in a podcast, we have a very candid conversation. Like, this is how much it costs to produce a season of a, high quality, beautifully produced show. Do you want to foot the bill for the first season before you potentially sell it to a network or broker your own sponsorship deals? Or are you unwilling to move forward until someone offers to pay you to do this? And it's a really smart conversation. And I have a ton of respect for any creator who's been around the block or who has just been observing this whole phenomenon for the last 10 years. And it's like, yeah, I'm not going to just work for free for, the ad dollars that will go to someone else because I made content that somebody else's ads ran on. So I want to bring this up because if you've been kind of on the fence about podcasting, or you're trying to figure out where you want to invest in the next year in your online media, if you're thinking about ownership of content, if you're thinking about how do I get paid for my work no matter what it is, like if I'm sharing my wisdom or entertainment or commentary or insight or conversations or friends, how do I get paid so that I'm actually in alignment with my own values around labor? I have a couple things for you to consider and to just help you think through, like, how would podcasting fit into my goals for both revenue and income and also my values? Like, you could make your first season of your show for free or do it yourself or foot the bill for a production house, but should you? And it's not going to be the same answer for everyone. There are definitely specific cases where it makes a ton of sense for maybe a small business owner or a founder or someone with a large following to pay for their own first season of their show because they might have an immediate return on investment that they know they can bring in based on existing product lines or sponsors that they already have relationships with, and they know that they can go to that sponsor and offer them to sponsor the first season of a show and get, at least the minimal cost covered. You also might be considering podcasting as purely an educational channel to educate paying customers who already are in one of your programs or already paying you in another way. So I'm not saying this is a definitive, no one should make podcasts without getting paid going forward, but I am going to give you a couple of things to think about. If you know that you have already developed the skill of demanding attention from a niche audience, like you've learned how to speak to the people who are interested in what you talk about, and you know that you have some media experience, like you've been around the block, you've been interviewed many times, you've spoken on stages, you are very comfortable in front of a camera or a microphone, you've presented many times digitally and in person. If you've gotten good feedback and you know that you're an interesting, skilled speaker, conversationalist, show host, there is an opportunity now to present that skill to a brand or to a network. And there's like a language now that people will understand that they didn't quite have a few years ago, because a lot of networks within podcasting between 2020 and 2022, they spent a ton of money paying celebrities and well-known folks to host podcasts, and they just footed the bill and paid the hosts a lot of money. And what kind of has come from that, now that we're about 3 years out from that experiment, is most people are not talented show hosts. And that's not like a judgment, it's just a fact. It takes a lot of time and effort and talent and skill to actually be a good show host. And so there are some obvious standout cases that have done amazingly well, but they're the minority. And most of the investments really didn't end up paying off. And it was a big lesson for networks and studios to realize, like, we can't just put a bunch of money towards celebrities who have millions of followers. That doesn't mean they'll be a great show host who will command a huge podcast audience and bring us tons of money in ad revenue. And so studios and networks are now becoming much more interested in partnering with and producing shows with and paying show hosts who have the skill already. and a proven track record. Like, I know this medium, I know this type of audience, I understand the labor involved, I understand how to present on camera, I understand how to manage my time, I understand how to show up with the energy needed, I understand how to take notes from producers. You might think that like a celebrity in TV or film already has those skills, and sometimes they do, but a lot of times it doesn't translate. And a lot of times it's just not been interesting to a celebrity because maybe the money isn't interesting enough, or it's not creative enough, or it's too time consuming, or there's a laundry list of reasons why someone who has a lot of experience in TV and film may not translate to podcasting. And so there's now an opportunity and kind of, I would say, a maturity and an awareness on the network and studio side that the personalities they want to make shows with in the future need to have like the skills already. And of course, it's important that you can prove that you have an audience that is responding to you and likes you. And that's the bigger of an audience you have, the better. But they're no longer just looking at audience size or fame to vet good show hosts. So that's the first point I want you to consider. Like, take a stock of your own talents and strengths and what you've been building for the last 10, 20 years as far as audience, skills, media presence, etc. And then maybe start to think about some networks or some brands, because this can also be said for branded podcasts. We'll talk about that in a second. Like, who would you be interested in partnering with? And go to their website and look at their contact info and see what kind of shows they've been producing and what their new shows are, maybe versus what their shows were a few years ago. And you can kind of start to get a read of where a network is focusing or investing. And you can pitch yourself. Like, you can just pitch yourself. That doesn't mean I think everyone can just like skyrocket to the top of a network's list as a show host. But there are, I think, going to be a lot more niche networks in the future who have kind of figured out the audience that they're best suited to make content for. And then they will be very focused on the right people to host their shows. Some of the really big networks that have kind of dominated the scene for the last few years because they just had a lot of money, I think there's a lot of evolution happening within them right now. There's kind of a reckoning and a reorganization and a lot of layoffs and a lot of cutting shows. And so they're kind of still trying to figure out where the profits and the value is in podcasting. But some of the smaller networks that are more niche, like, they get it, and they will be delighted to talk to you if you have the right mix of skills. Okay, the second point I want you to consider, and I just alluded to it, is branded podcasts, which I think I shared in previous video on the series, our podcast predictions for 2024. Branded podcasts is probably one of the most exciting emerging opportunities for show hosts to get paid to podcast. And in a nutshell, brands like large companies that have big marketing budgets are starting to realize like podcasting really is an attractive way to market. And there's like a loyalty and an intimacy and a depth of relationship that they can develop with customers and potential customers through podcasting. And so they're starting to invest more and more in branded podcasts. Like, the company pays for and sponsors the show, but the show isn't necessarily like about the company. A good example, I literally read about this morning, like a fashion brand, Caroline Herrera. They have a podcast hosted by, I think it was like an editor at Vogue and then maybe a stylist or a model, and they are having discussions about like women's empowerment in the world of business and fashion. So it's sponsored by this big fashion brand, but it's actually like a very interesting talk show. That's the kind of podcast we call a branded podcast because it only has one sponsor, the company that is behind it, where they're looking now more and more to hire hosts for their show who get the niche that they are in and get the audience they're trying to talk to. And they realize it's so much more valuable to have show hosts that they can hire to host those conversations or those narrative style episodes or whatever they may choose. Because a lot of times their executive team or even their marketing team like doesn't have the personality or the skill or the time to be a show host, right? being a show host means you have a media personality and you understand how to translate that to an audience. So that's what I want you to consider. If you've been kind of on the sidelines and looking at the landscape and being like, I'm done doing creative work that's unpaid, I want you to consider these options that are already here, but I think are going to grow and kind of become a much more viable path forward for a lot of seasoned media personalities who realize, like, I have got skills and I'm not just going to go make stuff for free anymore. Okay, that's our video for this week. I would love for you to subscribe to our channel. We're bringing you weekly videos, continuing with show host tips, answering your questions, like really keeping on top of where podcasting is heading, especially for personal brands, which is our specialty. And I will see you next time.